Hello, students. We're going to talk about Chapter 15, Section 4 today, The Nation Divides. We're going to talk about John Brown's raid and how the South seceded, meaning they left. That's a good vocabulary term for you to know. They seceded and left the Union. Okay, we'll start with building background on page 493. Unpopular compromises and court decisions deepened the divisions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates. The Lincoln-Douglas debates attracted more attention on the issue. As the disagreements grew, violence increased. Though many Americans hoped to avoid it, it was too late to keep the nation unified. Raid on Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry is a small town today it's in West Virginia, but originally it was in Virginia, and it sits across the river from West Virginia and Maryland today. It's kind of a unique river town, but has train rails running to all different areas. So West Virginia, Virginia, and Maryland. It's a very interesting place. It also housed a federal arsenal there, which is where John Brown wanted to confiscate arms and hand them out to slaves and create a rebellion or a revolt. So raid on Harper's Ferry, 493. In 1858, John Brown started an uprising. He wanted to attack the federal arsenal in Virginia and seize weapons there. He planned to arm local slaves. Brown expected to kill or take hostage white Southerners who stood in his way. He urged abolitionists to give him money so he could support a small army, but after nearly 2 years, Brown's army only had 20 men. On the night of October 16, 1859, John Brown's raid began when he and his men took over the arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in hopes of starting a slave rebellion. He sent several of his men into the countryside to get slaves to join him. However, enslaved African Americans did not come to Harper's Ferry, fearing punishment if they took part. Instead, white Southerners attacked Brown. 8 of his men and 3 local men were killed. Brown and some of his followers retreated to a firehouse. Federal troops arrived in Harper's Ferry the following night. The next morning, Colonel Robert E. Lee, remember that name? He'll be the main general in the Civil War for the South. But right now, he's actually a federal colonel, so he's working for the United States. He ordered a squad of Marines to storm the firehouse in a matter of seconds. The Marines killed 2 more of Brown's men and captured the rest, including Brown. All right, moving to 494. Here's an interesting speech by John Brown at the top. John Brown's last speech. At his trial after being pronounced guilty, John Brown spoke in his own defense about his plan to free the slaves. Quote, I intended certainly to have made a clean thing of that matter, meaning freeing slaves. I never did intend to murder or treason or the destruction of property or to excite or incite slaves to rebellion or to make insurrection or a revolt. Had I interfered in the matter which I admit I be in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, it would have been all right. Every man in this court would have deemed an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. I believe I have interfered as I have done on the behalf of his despised poor is no wrong but right. So kind of what John Brown's saying there, if he would have done it in the sense for rich people, people go, oh, yeah, it's okay. But he feels because he did it in the sense for poor people or slaves, it was not okay. That's how he's feeling. Brown quickly convicted of treason, murder, and conspiracy. Some of his men received death sentences. John A. Copeland, a fugitive slave, defended his actions. If I am dying for freedom, I could not die for a better cause. Convinced that he also would be sentenced to death, Brown delivered a memorable speech. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I say let it be done. As expected, the judge ordered Brown to be hanged. The sentence was carried out 1 month later, on December 2nd, 1859. Many Northerners mourned John Brown's death, but some abolitionists criticized his extreme actions. Abraham Lincoln said Brown agreed with us in thinking slavery wrong. However, Lincoln continued that cannot excuse violence, bloodshed, or treason. Most Southern whites, both slaveholders and non-slaveholders, felt threatened by the actions of John Brown. They worried that a John Brown II might attack. One South Carolina newspaper voiced these fears. We are convinced of the safety of the South lies only outside the present Union, meaning they had to get out of the country, out of the Union. Another newspaper stated that the sooner we get out of the Union, the better. In the election of 1860, in this climate of distrust, Americans prepared for another presidential election. The Northern and Southern Democrats could not agree on a candidate. Northern Democrats chose Senator Stephen Douglas. Southern Democrats backed the current Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, who supported slavery in the territories. Meanwhile, a new political party emerged, the Constitutional Union Party. Recognized no political principles other than the Constitution of the United States and the enforcement of the laws. Members of this new party met in Baltimore, Maryland, and selected John Bell of Tennessee as their candidate. Bell was a slaveholder, but he opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Senator William Seward of New York was Republicans' leading candidate at the start of their convention, but it turned out Lincoln appealed to more party members. A moderate who was against the spread of slavery, Lincoln promised not to abolish slavery where it already existed. Douglas, Breckinridge, and Bell each knew he might not win the election. They hoped to win enough electoral votes to prevent Lincoln from winning the Electoral College, but with the unified Republican Party behind him, Lincoln won. Although he received the highest number of votes, he won only about 40% of the overall popular vote. Lincoln won 180 of 183 electoral votes in free states. Douglas had the second highest number of popular votes, but he won only one state. He earned just 12 electoral votes. Breckinridge and Bell split votes in other slave states. The election result angered Southerners. Lincoln did not campaign in their region and did not carry any Southern states, but he became the next president. The election signaled that the South was losing its national political power. Take a look on page 495. Look at the states that Lincoln won, which are in the purple, and the Southern Democrats are in the green, and the Constitutional Union Party is in the yellow. So this is why it's called sectionalism. Sections of the country went against each other in their opinion. The South secedes. Lincoln insisted that he would not change slavery in the South. However, he said that slavery could not expand and thus would eventually die out completely. That idea angered many Southerners. Southerners' reactions. People in the South believed their economy and way of life would be destroyed without slave labor. They reacted immediately within a week of Lincoln's election. South Carolina's legislature called for a special convention. The delegates considered secession. Southern secessionists believed that they had the right to leave the Union. They pointed out that each of the original states had voluntarily joined the Union by holding a special convention that had ratified for the Constitution. Surely, they reasoned, states could leave the Union by the same process. Critics of secession thought this argument was ridiculous, but Buchanan said the Union was not a mere voluntary association of states to be dissolved at pleasure by any one of the contracting parties. President-elect Abraham Lincoln agreeing, saying no state upon its mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union. So that's another debate. So people thought, oh, well, we joined voluntarily, we agreed, we can join the Union, we can just leave the Union. That was another hot topic for debate. And of course, Lincoln would not be for that. He did not want any states to leave the Union. One of his main goals as president was to keep the Union together, to keep it unified. Obviously, after the state seceded, that didn't happen for a while, but he did bring the South back into the Union. All right. Lincoln added they can only do so by law and by revolution. While South Carolina representatives were meeting in Charleston to discuss secession, Congress examined the plan to save the Union. Senator John J. Crittenden of Kentucky proposed a series of constitutional amendments he believes would satisfy the South by protecting slavery. Crittenden hoped that the country would avoid secession and the Civil War. Lincoln disagreed with Crittenden's plan. He believed that there could be no compromise about the extension of slavery. Lincoln wrote, "The tug has come, and the better now than later." A Senate committee voted on Crittenden's plan. Every Republican rejected it, as Lincoln requested. The Confederate States of America. The South Carolina elected to dissolve the Union, now subsisting between the South Carolina and other states, on December 20th, 1860. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas also seceded from the Confederate States, also called the Confederacy, and its new constitution guaranteed citizens the right to own slaves. Delegates from seceded states elected Jefferson Davis of Mississippi as president of the Confederacy. Davis had hoped to be the commanding general of Mississippi's troops. He responded to the news of his election with reluctance, meaning he didn't really want it. When the southern states seceded, the question of who owned federal property in the South arose. For instance, the forts of the harbors of Charleston, South Carolina, were federal property. However, Confederate President Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy were ready to prevent a federal army from controlling the property. Lincoln takes office. President Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861. In his writing an inaugural address, Lincoln looked to many of the nation's founding documents, referring to the idea that the government received their just powers from the consent of the governed. That means I'm getting my power from the people that elected me, and that's where it comes from. A line from the Declaration of Independence, Lincoln stated this country was what the institutions belong to the people who inhabited it. Whenever they grow weary of the existing government, they can exercise their constitutional right of amending it or revolutionary right to dismember it, take it apart, or overthrow it. I cannot be ignorant of the fact that many worthy and patriotic citizens are desirous of having the national constitution amended. While he believed that the U.S. citizens had the power to change their government through majority consent, he opposed the idea that southern states could leave the Union because they were unhappy with the government's position on slavery. He announced his inaugural address that he would keep all government property in the seceding states. However, he also tried to convince Southerners that his government would not provoke a war. He hoped, given time, southern states would return to the Union. Summary and preview: the secession of the southern states hinted at the violence to come. In the next chapter, you will read about the Civil War. All right, that's it for section 4, and we'll see you later. Have a great day.